by representatives from 4 different think tanks today. It really is the wonk world mayhem on this panel. And we're going to be asking, should we reduce immigration? Now, my name is Reem, Ibrahim, and I work in communications at the Institute of Economic Affairs. And we're going to be asking this number one question that I think will be dominating the political scene for quite a while. It's a topic that has also divided the Conservative Party quite substantially. But as we all know, immigration is on the rise. Total long-term immigration was estimated to be about around 1.2 million in 2022. So emigration was about 557,000, meaning that migration continues to rise and add to the population. Most people that come to this country are non-EU nationals. It was followed by about 151,000 from the EU and 88,000 Brits. Now, that's all legal immigration. The asylum backlog has reached 175,000. And many critics claim that the asylum seekers, many of them are not indeed asylum seekers, but are attempting to game the system, including our very own Home Secretary, Suella Braverman. Our Home Secretary has described illegal immigration and the crisis as an invasion. She has, just last week, she gave a speech in the US saying that uncontrolled immigration, inadequate integration, and a misguided dogma of multiculturalism have proven a toxic combination for Europe over the last few decades. Many argue, however, that immigration has contributed to the British economy. As of August this year, we had 989,000 job vacancies in the United Kingdom. The hospitality and retail sector are particularly struggling. And many business owners, including CEO of Next, Lord Wolfson, argued that and effectively called on the government for more immigration in order to fill up those vacancies. So we find ourselves in a particularly interesting situation, and to discuss this, I'm so delighted to be joined by my fellow wonks in this battle of the think tanks. So, to my left, on the far left, certainly not politically, we have Karl Williams, who is the Deputy Research Director at the Centre for Policy Studies. His work at the CPS has mainly focused on political economy, energy and immigration. Also to my left, we have Conor Holohan, who is the Media Campaign Manager at the Taxpayers Alliance. After graduating from Cardiff in 2018, Conor worked in the Welsh Parliament as an advisor before managing communications for the leader of the opposition in Wales. To the far right, we have Matthew Lesh, who is the IEA's Director of Public Policy and Communication. You might find him regularly across television and radio. And also to my right, we have Maxwell Marlow, who is the Director of Research at the Adam Smith Institute. Before working at the ASI, he also worked as a Public Affairs and Communications Executive at Hanbury Strategy. And he was also previously Development and Research Officer for the ASI. Also, old friend from university. So, Karl, would you like to start? You're each going to have 5 minutes to make your case. Should we reduce immigration? Off you go.
Thank you, Reem. Yes, we should reduce immigration. In the 25 years after Tony Blair came to power in 1997, cumulative net migration to the UK totalled 5.9 million people. In the 25 years before that, it totalled 68,000. Last year in 2022, net migration came in at least 606,000, possibly it'll be much higher when they revise the stats. That added 0.9% to the population of the UK. Now, what has been the result of this unprecedented and ongoing experiment? Now, obviously, immigration has brought many benefits, not least to the migrants themselves, but I would argue that such has been the scale and pace of migration over the past 25 years that the negatives now have come to far outweigh the positives. In particular, our democratic, our political institutions have been undermined. Migration on this scale has corroded social trust, it has eroded national security, it has undermined growth, and it has depressed living standards. Now, all these ills, migration is far from the only factor involved, but I think it is an inescapable and integral part of the picture. Allow me to illustrate 3 of these points in a bit more detail. So, in terms of politics and political institutions, in every election since 1997, the winning party has promised to reduce migration. Every election, it has gone up afterwards. Most recently, the Conservatives promised overall numbers will come down. Last year, net migration came in at 12 times the level it was in 1997. I think the broken promises on this have done more to obliterate trust in politics and politicians and institutions than perhaps anything else, with the possible exception of the expenses scandal and perhaps the attempt to overturn Brexit. Already 25% of people do not trust any politicians to handle the issue of migration. Brexit might have been a safety valve, and you could definitely ask, had net migration been running at less than 100,000 per year in the 10 or 15 years before Brexit, would it have happened? I suspect not. Now, in terms of living standards, I see a fair few young faces in the audience, and that means people who are trying to get up the housing ladder or dealing with the rental markets in places like London, Birmingham, or here in Manchester. Net migration last year meant that almost 350,000 people entered the rental market in England. Net migration last year, in order to keep steady in terms of the housing requirements, we should have built, and this is just in England, 210,000 houses. In fact, net dwelling completions were 178,000 units. Now, I think we'd all agree in here, the fundamental problem with the housing market is we don't build enough, we need reform, scrap the Counter-Plan Act, that's all great. But we live in the politically constrained world that we live in, and at the moment we are running up a down escalator. We are making the problem worse and worse, and this is rents up, house costs up, living standards down. Now, in terms of economic growth, we have almost stumbled by accident into an economic model in this country of high energy costs for which we substitute cheap migrant labour in a process that disincentivizes capital investment. The International Federation of Robotics points out that the UK has got the lowest level of industrial automation in the developed world. So 101 industrial robots per 10,000 manufacturing workers. That's a quarter of the level in Japan. They have 9 times as many in South Korea. And this is something that has been a key factor in undermining productivity growth. And again, I stress it's not the only factor. But I really think the onus is on the pro-migration voices to explain why this record period of migration has coincided with the slowest period of productivity growth in Britain in over 2 centuries. So I'm conscious of time, so I will just wrap up to say, clearly there is an optimal level of migration, and that will vary by time and by place. But over the last 25, 30 years, we have succeeded that in the UK, and therefore we need to bring numbers down substantially from where they are now, and probably keep net migration fairly low for a period of time until we can catch up in terms of infrastructure and integration.
Thanks, Karl. You said it all.
Thank you, Karl. Maxwell, off you go.
Well, this will be fun. So I'd like to start with just a quick remark about, well, return quickly on the record low investment, record low productivity. We've had the lowest share of capital investment in the G7 since the 1970s. And as you pointed out, Karl, immigration was very low then. The only time this differed was with Margaret Thatcher, but we remain at the bottom of the G7. Capital investment is a malaise in this country. We really avoid doing it for various reasons, which we can get into afterwards. Now, look, we want to frame terms here. We're not asking for open borders. That doesn't work. Milton Friedman very famously pointed that out, that one can't have a welfare state if one has open borders, mainly because the open borders would destroy the welfare state. So we're asking for essentially saying the current level, where it is economically necessary. The reason I point to this is I point to the Treasury Green Book. Now, as Karl's pointed out, essentially, politicians have repeatedly promised to bring down migration. The reason they don't do it is because the economists in the Treasury tell them not to. When you look at the Green Book, it says very clearly, we need 337,000 people at least to come into the country and work the jobs that we don't have the skills to apply. It's very simple, and it's a simple economic argument, at least from where we stand. Let's look at the growth challenges we face. Demography is one of them. Japan, there is a serious problem to the point where the late, great Shinzo Abe was telling citizens of Japan to get off their video games and start having sex with each other because they just weren't having enough children. It's the same case here. If you want to have a future, or at least maintaining economic growth for some time, even though we don't have much of it, and that's a very storied and long problem, we need more people to come into the country and do the work. Karl spoke of the housing crisis. He's right. I mean, look, we do have a serious greenbelt problem, and we don't have enough houses for people to come into the country. But who is going to build the houses? I know it may sound like the woman on Question Time during the Brexit referendum who said, "Who's going to serve the coffee at Pret?" Mock as we wish, she was right. When I speak to people in the hospitality industry, their main concern, apart from planning and business rates and taxes, is they don't have enough staff. It is a simple problem. As Reem has pointed out in the opening remarks, we don't have enough. We have way too many vacancies in this economy, and it's seriously damaging the way in which the economy grows and how wealth is distributed. It is that simple. Now, look. When we look at the figures themselves, as Reem pointed out as well, 1.2 million net, 1.2 million gross. This also, unusually, for some reason Britain does this, no one else does, include students who only stay here for about 3 years, 4 years maybe if they do a master's, or if they go to Scotland. Essentially, we are very bad at collecting statistics in this country, and this is part of the problem. It whips up a rhetoric, which I think is quite damaging to social trust, whereby people are victimised for wanting to come and make a better life for themselves and give to the country that they come to. As I like to say with the ONS, it's like Swiss cheese, their numbers. It's full of holes and smells. It's really not very good. And this is part of the problem as well. When it feeds into political rhetoric, it's not good. Now, there are problems, of course. The asylum seekers on boats coming over. I mean, I'm very clear on this. If you don't come to the country legally, you have to be removed. It's that simple. You undermine the system entirely. But that's a different problem. This isn't immigration per se. This is asylum seeking and trying to bend the games of the system. That needs to change. And I take, finally, I'll finish on this with the national security problem. When you look at the numbers of people who commit terrorist offences in this country, it is, there is a high proportion of people who aren't native Brits. That's true. But there is a very high proportion of far-right extremists in this country who are born and bred here, who grow up in, poor areas and, feel quite, angry at the system and want to commit terrorism. The majority of them are native British people, and the statistical proportions are quite high, and it's quite concerning. So it seems like a demonisation, really, on this problem. So that's where I'll end it. Demographic problems, vacancies in jobs, the fact that as much as I do like my fellow interlocutors on my left, your right, unfortunately I think they've got it wrong here. We need to let in as many people as we do, and then we can fix the problems that are facing us all. Thank you.
Excellent, Max. Conor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I agree with Max, as we all should, that we don't want to vilify anyone who wants to come to this country, make a better life for themselves. It's a sort of completely logical thing to do. But as Max says, we can't have total open borders. It doesn't mean that everyone who wants to go to a different country because it has a better benefit system or more opportunities can do so. We have to look at what it means for taxpayers, which is obviously my remit in particular, and what it means for taxpayers when you have historic levels of migration. We have not seen net migration go below 100,000 net a year since the 90s, save the pandemic. And what happens when you have that level of migration is public services are stretched. We have record NHS waiting lists. That knocks into growth as well, where people who should be fit to work are not because they're waiting around for operations. It has an impact on school places and the quality of education people can get. So this level of migration damages the interaction that a taxpayer has with public services, and that's obviously suboptimal. And also, moving on to housing, which Karl mentioned, is we have a housing crisis. A lot of young people in this room who are engaged with the rental market, looking to go onto the housing ladder for the first time, and having this level of migration means that you just have a greater level of demand for the same or not sufficiently growing supply. The political will to build the houses that we need isn't necessarily there. Of course, there are a lot of people in rooms like this who talk about it a lot, and we all want to see it get done, but at the end of the day, you have MPs who have NIMBYs in their constituencies, and that's the way it's going to be. And so the idea that we can sort of keep building in order to satisfy this supply, it's for the birds. And then on the growth point, migration, the great driver of growth. Well, we've had these historic levels of migration for 20 years, and we've had sluggish growth. We've had flat growth. Max makes the point about demographics and how that impacts on growth. But the more people come to a country in order to satisfy that demographic need, the more people down the line you have to have come over as well, because it's a pyramid. You need more people to support them as they age. And on these sort of skills to apply in vacancies, we do have lots of vacancies, but we also have 1 in 5 Brits is not in work and is not looking for work. And so we don't necessarily have the skills to apply, but you talk about serving coffee at Pret. I mean, most people can serve coffee at Pret, I believe. So, to summarise, 600 question is, should immigration be lower? Last figures we've got, it's net 600,000. And if you keep adding that number of people into a country again and again and again and again, public services are going to suffer. The supply will far outstrip demand for housing. And from the evidence we have, we'll continue to see sluggish growth.
Excellent. And Matthew?
Where to start? I mean, let's be absolutely clear here and unashamed about this. Immigrants are good for Britain. They're good culturally, good fiscally, and good economically. If you want to think about skills gaps, as we've said, there are 900,000 skills vacancies. If you want to see the quality of public services without immigrants, I mean, 1/3 of NHS doctors are immigrants. The public services would very much struggle without immigrants. It's the same matter for public finances. On net, immigrants between 2000 and 2011 contribute 25 billion to public finances. Domestic people, native-born people on net take out of public services. Immigrants contribute on net to public services. So when it comes to those points about public finances and when it comes to public services, immigrants are absolutely essential. But immigrants are essential in so many more ways. I mean, something like 50% of the UK's fastest-growing businesses have one foreign-born co-founder. About 17% of the overall workforce are foreign-born. We know the lump of labour fallacy is nonsense. More immigrants coming to the country doesn't reduce productivity. In fact, the opposite. Often immigrants are filling skills gaps and are doing so in a productive and meaningful way. When you look at this debate, it seems to be quite silly in another way, which is the reason why the UK has been so attractive to immigrants over the last 20 years is actually a really good news. It's because the UK is a place where people want to come and contribute and set up their lives. And the fact that of the prosperity of our recent era is interconnected very closely to that. So it's not a bad thing that people want to come to the UK. It's actually a very good thing. And we should be proud of that as someone, myself an immigrant, obviously, as well. Maybe you don't think I'm making much of a contribution, I don't know. Views may differ. I think a final point here, which is a kind of a burden for those who want to reduce immigration. So I think often you can find more or less around 40% of people want to reduce immigration, 40% of people are happy with the current level. But once you actually dig down into individual categories, the message very much changes, which is, do you want more immigrant doctors? 53%. Do you want more immigrant nurses? 54%. Do you want more immigrant care workers at 46%? They all want more immigration of those types. And when you come to reducing immigrants, you only see 18% wanting fewer seasonal fruit workers and vegetable pickers. So I suppose the onus on those who do want to reduce immigrant numbers is, who are you cutting out here? Do you not want doctors coming and working in the NHS? Do you not want school teachers coming and teaching kids? Do you want those fewer Hong Kongers to be able to come to the UK to escape communist China? Do you not want Ukrainian refugees to be able to come to the UK? And then another burden I want to put on you, which is who's going to pay the higher taxes, that 25 billion of net finances? How high do you want taxes to go because you're not willing to increase the size of the labour force? And on top of that, with skills shortages, how high are you going to allow inflation to go because we can't fill the skills gaps in the economy? It seems like it's very easy to blame immigrants for a whole bunch of issues, which is effectively what the other side of this debate does. In truth, the reason why we have a housing crisis is because we haven't built enough homes. Even if we didn't have immigrants, we still wouldn't have enough homes in the places where we need them, and house prices would still be very high. It would just be much poorer as a result. Growth in the UK is mediocre, not because of immigrants, quite the opposite. Immigrants probably ensured the economy's grown in the last 20 years. Immigrants made a massive contribution there. We know growth is low because we haven't had enough business investment, because we're overtaxed, because we're overregulated, and all those other reasons why we haven't been as productive as we could have been. So I suppose in the kind of conclusion of my opening remarks, immigrants provide a huge contribution to the UK, and there's no other way to look at it.
So, to kick off the discussion, I'm going to be asking the affirmative side. So, Conor, I'll start with you. Matthew makes a great point. There are these labour shortages, and ultimately, if we're not going to fill those vacancies with migrants, we can, sort of kiss goodbye to any notion of economic growth unless we are filling up those vacancies. But if we're not going to be filling up those vacancies with more immigration, how do we do it?
Well, I think we need to, like I say, we've got 1 in 5 Brits, we learned recently, is not employed or not looking for work as well. There is a workforce there.
So would you reduce benefits?
Yeah, well, you need to incentivize that group of people to be in work. That's a really urgent thing that we should do, whether we do or don't increase or decrease immigration. So, yeah, we have a workforce ready to work. We need to be incentivizing them to go get to work and go back to work. And obviously, Jeremy Hunt's trying to do a lot for the sort of early retired lot, but there's a lot of younger people as well. So yeah, that's how we can solve that.
Interesting. And Karl, how can we incentivize? So I think it was Fraser Nelson that actually wrote a piece in The Spectator about this. So effectively, crunching the numbers, argued that there are about 5.3 million people on out-of-work benefits. It looked at the proportion of those individuals. Now, I'm sure that both Matthew and Maxwell would probably agree that that number is too high. But Karl, how do we, if we're not using migration to fill up those vacancies, do we do it by getting those people off of benefits? Are there too many people on benefits?
There's a mixture of short-term and long-term factors here. So, yes, there are issues around economic activity, which are partly a legacy of the pandemic, and partly it started rising about a year before that. And there are welfare reforms we should look at, and I think simply saying cut benefits oversimplifies the complexity of this. And this partly touches on the point about, for example, NHS doctors. There are long-term issues around the number of people for roles in healthcare and other areas that we train in the UK. And if we are going to get migration numbers down from where they are at the moment, there are areas where we're going to need fairly fundamental structural reform. Education is also another very good example of this. So at the moment we have a system where effectively the only check on student migration, and I'll come back to the definition of that in a sec, is how fast can universities expand their courses. And this migration still matters. We can't erase it from the figures. Because at the moment the universities capture the benefits of this migration, but all the externalities are placed on generally the big cities with public services and housing pressures.
Interesting. And Maxwell, so I'm assuming based on what you've said that you would argue that immigration, is required economically for to fill up those vacancies. What would the UK look like in terms of economic growth, or in general? You can even make the cultural argument. What will the UK look like if we don't fill up those vacancies using migration?
Well, you continue to have quite a sluggish economy. I mean, it's very hard to model culture. In fact, you can't. I think there is a danger there's a bit of a danger on the neoliberal side, really. I think, and I'm fortunately going to name drop Sam Bowman here, who that culture doesn't exist. It does exist, and there are members of the Conservative Party, indeed the government, who've come to this country, relatives came to this country, integrated incredibly well. And really dug into British culture. So the culture argument, it's difficult. I'm drawn to one of the Adam Smith Institute's senior fellows, James Bartholomew, who wrote an excellent book called The Welfare of Nations. And he was in France, looking, these kind of council house kind of estates, kind of leviathans even. And a lot of the immigrants had come over from Algeria, for example, were just kind of parcelled off and put in there. And he was meeting this representative from the French Parliament, and the representative goes, "I wouldn't go there. oh no, we haven't invested in it in years, and that's why, you know, crime is at an all-time high. There are drug dealers, rapists, horrible characters that, you know, often the label is put on immigrants for that. It's because there is a kind of failure of governments to invest in these areas and to properly integrate them within, you know, within society. The school I went to school in Stoke-on-Trent, and I went to a small independent school where half the kids' parents were working in the local NHS hospital, brilliantly integrated, no problems at all. So the cultural argument is you can solve it, but you have to make a real effort to. And the government has just simply chosen not to do that. And now they'll turn around and demonise the immigrants. That's the problem. If we look at the job vacancies, the Adam Smith Institute published a paper about 3 months ago, called, it's about visa auctions. It's called Opening for Our Excellence. It's written by one of our fellows, Dr. Brian Chang at King's College London, and one of our newer authors, Duncan McClements, who is, as far as I'm concerned, a sentient calculator. He's incredible. And they do a lot of game theoretic modelling, and they work out that, you know, if you don't fill up those spaces, you end up in a massive recession. What you can do is offer visas at an auction, and auction them for, well, depends on what the auction says. They had a base rate of about £300,000 per space, can generate tens of billions of pounds in revenue for the Exchequer, and tens and tens and tens of billions of pounds in growth for the economy. There are serious policy solutions to this when you create a proper market for them, and yeah, it's really that simple.
Interesting. I think just focusing on this, sticking with the economics, we will move on to the cultural debate on that as well. Matthew, is it feasible to, I mean, so, you know, the other side have argued that these vacancies can be filled through existing people that already live in this country. Is that feasible?
Look, absolutely not. I mean, if it would be ideal. I mean, I absolutely think it's tragic that 1 in 5 people of working age population are not currently in work, and every government lever possible should be pulled to encourage them into the workplace. It's not as simple as saying 1 in 5 people are unemployed. A lot of those people have been assessed as not being able to work. Possibly that interrelates to the failure of the NHS, possibly relates to, you know, cultural issues and motivation. There is no simple way to give those people the skills and the inclination and the capacity to work. If there was, it is much easier for a company to hire someone domestically than it is to pay the fees and go through the paperwork of getting a foreign immigrant. And so your incentive is always to try to hire domestically in the first instance before seeking foreign labour. So unfortunately, it's not as simple as that. And even if all those people were able to work, can I add that immigrants would still be beneficial to the UK? It would still be beneficial for all the other reasons of people being able to come to the economy, come to the UK, create more economic activity, pay money into through tax, fill skills gaps, start companies, do all the kinds of things that we know immigrants do. So immigration would still be good even if we could get, you know, every single one of those people to work, which doesn't seem particularly feasible a policy solution.
And I think that's interesting with regard to the way in which public services are obviously funded as well. Matthew, I'm just going to come back to you on that. Do you think it's then feasible to increase the capacity of public services in the current political climate? Conor made the point that we're not going to effectively completely abolish the welfare state in order to respond to that demand. So open borders are of course not feasible. But is it feasible to expand the current service that the government provides us, whether that be healthcare or education? A lot of that infrastructure needs to expand in its offering if we do have more people live here. Is that feasible?
Well, if you look at the simple fact that immigrants are actually paying a huge amount to be able to access public services when they use the UK. The UK basically has an immigrant tax. It's called an NHS surcharge. So immigrants are forced not only to pay, I think it's now something like 400 quid per year of their visa, so 2,000 quid to come to the UK on a 5-year visa per person, including any dependents. And then they also pay tax. So immigrants are already paying huge amounts to help fund public services, and on net are contributors to funding towards public services, and then also tend to be younger and therefore are less likely to require any sort of healthcare or other public service, as well as being more likely to work in public services. So it seems like whichever way you turn it around, immigrants are on net making a massive contribution to public services. You can have a whole other debate. I mean, I think it would be reasonable to say immigrants couldn't access, welfare benefits, for example, and in fact, a lot can't, as it is, depending on the conditions on their visa. So you can take away that incentive if you so please. I see no problem with that whatsoever.
Could I just come back on this point about the migrants as net fiscal contributors? So the government, well, not the government, the Independent Migration Advisory Committee commissioned a study in 2016-17, which found that migrants from the European Economic Area were net contributors to the tune of 4.7 billion, but migrants from elsewhere were net drains to the tune of 9 billion. Now, at the moment, while migration mix is shifting decisively away from Europe and towards the world more widely, it's perhaps too early to say precisely how the skills mix might affect this. But as things stand, it looks like immigration is going to bring ever greater burden on the public finances rather than a net benefit.
I would seriously doubt that on the basis that under the kind of new... So there has been a rebalancing as part of taking back control of migration away from EU and towards the rest of the world. But those immigrants who are coming in from the rest of the world are coming in largely to do jobs and work in the UK. So
It does also include a couple of 100,000 dependents who presumably are not working.
But we'll have to be paying taxes, we'll have to be
They'll be
paying
in
the
school,
NHS
or they'll
surcharge.
be in care homes.
I would highly doubt that the maths of that changes, but maybe we can come back here in a few years and see where we end up.
Only time will tell. Only time will tell. So we've touched on the economics. I do think it's important to segue the conversation into some of the cultural arguments. I do think that, generally speaking, when you talk to people that are anti-immigration, the cultural arguments are probably one of the most important ones that are made. So, Karl, I mean, is there a lack of social cohesion as a result of migration? Has migration resulted in, a breakdown of these kind of British values?
Well, to quote the Cantle Commission, which was 2001, so under Blair, that was a big study into integration and migrant communities and reported communities, people living a series of parallel lives. And then the Casey Review, which is sort of updating these themes, I think this was 2017, found very similar things and described a situation of areas of the country where people were living, what's the exact quote? Sorry, the exact quote escapes me, but to paraphrase, areas of the country where people were living in opposition not just to British values, but sometimes also to British law. So I think the government and most authorities would accept there are clear integration problems, which is related to the scale of migration, and particularly the concentration of it, because it's not uniformly spread, it is very localised in particular areas, and there are some communities where there are problems. So we've talked a lot about economic inactivity and the role of migration in addressing that, but the Casey Review found that 57.2% of Bangladeshi and Pakistani women were economically inactive, which is a rate far higher than pretty much any other migrant group.
They're homemakers, probably, or they're making nice food for their families, most likely is the case. And I'm sure many of those that made the conservative argument would probably support that. Conor, do you think that there is this lack of social cohesion? Has migration totally doomed British values?
I think British values are probably on the run, not necessarily because of migration, but because of sort of, the way the public space is and the way that sort of ministers behave and all the rest of it. But I do think it puts people under a lot of pressure and strain when they can't get access to high quality services and their politicians tell them they're going to reduce migration and then they don't do so. So I think people feel frustration, and I think, people are under a lot of pressure as a result of that.
Mm-hmm.
I find that interesting. I'm sorry. I mean, firstly, that the Taxpayers Alliance is against having more taxpayers within the country and therefore increasing tax revenue, but also the fact that I think we all spend our professional lives and personal lives outside the MOG in Westminster complaining about how bad public services are because of the people who run them, the bureaucrats, the massive regulations, the fact that we have the ever-growing state, input into these, machineries of government. I just did a paper on the Social Value Act, which is one of the most horrendous pieces of legislation I've ever cast my eyes on. Has nothing to do with immigration. It's just poor governance. I really do push back against this idea that because they're kind of these public services are overutilised on a strain. No, they just run really badly. I mean, if we had public services, it would be like a larder. They're not exactly Rolls-Royce.
Okay, so, but Maxwell, do you think that cultural argument is valid? Are people that live in this country, not in London? I do think that it's very easy to, when you live in London, to say that migration has resulted in a melting pot of cultures and it's all very great. But if you leave the M25, many people feel very differently. Is that a fair argument?
Do they feel very differently? I mean, I haven't seen much data about this. I mean, really, it's a case of it's seriously a case of, yes, we do have a melting pot, and as I said in my earlier answer about James Bartholomew going to France and going to very different places and finding that the immigrants into the country were purposefully put aside and allowed to stoke up a feeling of resentment towards the authorities, towards the law, towards the government because of where they were placed. Absolutely, that's bad. The way in which immigrants have been, interspersed throughout society has been done poorly, and that's partly down to the way in which we build houses, how we, grow as an economy, how we grow demographically. I do push back against this idea that, immigrants are very bad, for culture. I mean, Reem, you are. Of immigrant background, and here you are. Here you are at a free market think tank working to I'd say the British values of liberty, low taxes, and a peaceful society. Indeed I am. We will have time for questions afterwards, don't worry. Yes, we will. Matthew, can you come in on this? What do you think about the cultural arguments? Are they valid?
I mean, if you read some of the replies I got on Twitter telling me to go back to Australia, you might think that I'm making a negative cultural contribution, or certainly some people do. I mean, I think on this cultural point, this is something the left often gets very wrong, which is they talk down Britain, they talk down British culture, they say the UK is inferior to other places and should feel guilty for historical wrongs, whilst at the same time being confounded that so many people want to move to the UK and come here and make their lives here. And I think kind of like a cultural confidence is necessary to successfully integrate people. I think immigrant societies like the US and Australia can show this pretty well, which is if you can basically integrate people into a culture that is proud of itself, it is far more effective than saying this is a terrible place and guilty, and that's what leads to a lot of the issues. I think there's also fairly the reason why one of the reasons why immigration is particularly high at the moment is because of the large number of Hong Kongers who moved to the UK. Has anyone heard any issues about Hong Kongers integrating into the UK? Has anyone seen one story? I mean, I could be wrong. I could be proven wrong because there's always one story about any problems with Hong Kongers. I'd say no, there hasn't been. And therefore, there's something. It's not. You can't make a kind of macro comment about immigrants. You need to look at a micro level about the individuals or the groups that are coming, and many can be very successfully integrated or don't even require integration necessarily if they're culturally similar enough to the UK.
Well, but I guess that's the point, right? Hong Kongers are culturally very, very similar to the United Kingdom, part of the reason why we have that special relationship with Hong Kong. So do you think then that we should be looking at certain cultures and preferencing them over other cultures in terms of coming to this country? I mean,
you do want a colourblind immigration system. You don't necessarily want to be making those kind of distinctions explicitly in the way you design your system, but you do want to encourage people to come to the country who are willing and to follow that path. Now, how you square that, I don't know exactly.
We'll get Karl on the door, and he'll vet everyone that comes to this country.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's some very crude ways of doing this, which the national citizenship test, for example, that are meant to go down some of that line and ensure that people have a greater understanding of Britain in order to become a citizen. Some of those kind of things, not necessarily that specific case thereof, but it's trying to create that culture amongst immigrants who come here if they don't already have it.
Okay, and do you think, Maxwell, in terms of integration, because really that's kind of what we're touching on here with the cultural arguments, how do we integrate people that do come to this country?
You send them to good schools. You put them in, good communities that are well looked after. that are economically, flourishing. I'm drawn to a study that I read a couple of years ago by a couple of Italian academics, Stanek and Collatoni, who did a very interesting survey of the same area of Italy, which before and after the recession, and they linked it to free trade, and they took their opinions of immigrants coming in. When they were rich, when they were, trading well, lots of income coming into the country, they found that people were overwhelmingly supportive of more immigrants. When times got bad, who did they turn on with the immigrants? I mean, it's down to having a rich and prosperous society at the end of the day, and that it changes people's perceptions of one another. It helps boost social trust and that social cohesion. The problem is that we don't have that at the moment, not because of the immigrants, but because of complete incompetence who run the government and are in this, blocking up the way in which we do things in this country, and it's not the immigrants.
Interesting. I mean, Karl, I want you to come back on this, and Conor, maybe you can comment as well. Do you think that why has integration failed, in your opinion?
Well, I think for this, I'd point us towards some of the research done in development economics, sort of the deep roots of prosperity. And I'm thinking here of Garrett Jones's book, The Culture Transplant, for example. And it shows quite convincingly the way values persist across generations, not just first-generation immigrants, but second, third, and so on. So you can look at patterns of migration to America, and there are very noticeable differences in the saving rates amongst descendants of Italian migrants and descendants of German migrants. So I think there are inherent difficulties to overcome anyway if you are looking to completely integrate, and maybe we're not, maybe you want some degree of integration but not 100% integration. And I to some extent agree with Max. There is a point here that the way government has handled migration has made this much worse. But ultimately it does come down to a question of concentration and flow rates. People need time to adapt. Change in this respect and has to be gradual. And that is partly why we need to reduce numbers now, because we have a system where actually we need time to catch up in terms of integrating the population we do have, rather than deepening existing divides.
Conor?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, sort of pre-1994, net migration was around zero, or with maybe sometimes more people left Britain than came into it. But yeah, like I say, sort of 20 years from the late 90s, net migration never dropped below 100,000 a year, and when you are going at that pace, I think integration does become more difficult. And yeah, we do need to catch up in terms of expanding our public services sufficiently if that's what we're going to do, or to build the appropriate infrastructure if that's the path we're going to go down, and to build the schools. So yeah, I think it's pace is the problem.
Interesting. Now, before we open up to the floor for Q&A, I just want to touch a little bit on illegal immigration, because we've touched on, generally speaking, on the way that immigration has impacted both the economy and also British culture. But of course, illegal immigration is on the rise. Where we've seen the asylum backlog from last summer, I believe it was about 100,000. The asylum backlog is now about 175,000. So clearly, there are many, many people that are on this kind of limbo between becoming potentially a citizen. Karl, first of all, why do we see such high levels of asylum seekers, and are they all really asylum seekers?
Okay, why do we see such high levels of asylum seekers? Two parts to that. Firstly, there is a global migration crisis. What's going on in the Channel is quite a small and localised expression of that. There are far greater problems in much of southern Europe and at the US-Mexican border. No one apart from the Australians, when they dealt with this problem 10 years ago, has really worked out the solution to this yet, or implemented the solution. But Britain also has its own particular pull factors. Some of these are things we can do very little about: English language, existing diasporas, sort of soft power reputation. Some of them are to do with how easy it is to access public services. So the lack of ID cards, for example, some of the sort of ease of slipping off into the grey economy. And we are much more lenient than many of our neighbours, and we have much more lenient asylum processes. So in terms of the number of Albanians we accept their asylum claims for, at one point it was running at something like 70%. In places like France and Germany, it's like 2 or 3%. We have hobbled ourselves with, for example, the modern slavery legislation, although the Illegal Migration Act has walked some of that back. So it's a mixture of global situation, particular factors to Britain that we can't control, and a variety of factors we can control, levers we can pull and have started pulling. In terms of whether asylum seekers, are they genuine asylum seekers? I would say no. They've passed through, almost all of them have passed through safe countries to get here already. They weren't being systematically persecuted in France. Something like, well, up until the end of 2022, I think 83% of them were men under the age of 40. They are engaged in what's known as asylum shopping. They're coming where they think their economic prospects are going to be best. And, you know, who could blame them for that individually? Why would you not want to come here? But yeah, clearly it's a problem.
Indeed. Conor, illegal immigration.
Yeah, I mean, it's a case of incentives, the classic old one. But I think the government doesn't help itself when trying to solve an issue like this. When it's, Taxpayers Alliance analysis showed that they've given 1.5 billion pounds to groups like the UNHCR, who lobby against policies like the Rwanda plan, and they're spending taxpayers' money on undermining their own policies.
Maxwell, are you convinced by this argument? Do you think that it's just purely an incentive problem? And I mean, what do we do to tackle illegal immigration?
So I'm with Jonathan's assumption on this, and we should leave the ECHR and we'll repeal it, and then put in our own legislation in place. I think if we've left the European Union, no matter what your opinion on that is, we should continue to build our own future with our own laws. I think that's a good idea. I will be probably disagreeing with Matthew on this. I do understand that. In terms of easily slipping into the grey economy, it's because we don't let asylum seekers work. And it's that simple, and that's why they cost a lot of money. They could be working and filling in, jobs. I would personally tag them to make sure they don't slip away like that whilst we process their applications, and then we can give them proper jobs. I mean, it's that simple. Help fill up some of the backlog there. I mean, in terms of, as I said in my opening remarks about illegal immigrants coming over and blatantly flouting the rules, send them back, unfortunately. I just think it really is a case, if you do not follow the rules, and, we complain, about, people not having a regard for, the law, the regulations, the low social trust. If you don't come here legally, you go back. It's that simple.
Matthew, illegal immigration.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a practically almost unsolvable problem. What Australia did is not replicable in the UK context. It is basically Australia paid a lot of money to Indonesia, both to beef up their law enforcement, but also to ensure when they turn boats around that people were returned to Indonesia or to whatever country they came from. Unfortunately, I don't think the French are particularly open to that solution, which makes it extremely difficult. And then once someone gets here, legally speaking, unless you're both going to leave ECHR as well as the UN Convention on Human Rights, maybe you want to make a case for that. The definition is, definitionally, a lot of these people probably are refugees. Not all of them. There was a big flow of Albanians, which I think has now slowed down, but there was a lot of them who genuinely are refugees. So once they get here, it's very hard for the government to do anything practically in response to that. I don't have a solution. I think it is a problem, and I agree it's a problem. I think it is also a problem for those who are sympathetic to immigration, because I think this toxifies the debate. It's that sense of loss of control and loss of order about immigrants coming to this country, or in the same case in Australia, where you see this debate really fire up, as it has today, about legal immigrants as well. People are far more comfortable with legal immigrants if they know that there isn't this large flow of people coming through irregular arrival paths.
Amazing. Let's open up to questions. Oh, look at that. Okay, well, let's go with you, because you did put your hand up before, didn't you?
Immigration has been a huge hot topic over the past 30 years, and in many parts of ancient societies as well. So despite that, in all parts of Europe, America, etc., is it the Tories, yourselves, Labour, Joe Biden, do you guys know better than the majority of these people that have been voting for these things? It's an election winner, which shows that people care about it. So why do you think that you necessarily know slightly better than people that have been voting for this?
Who wants to answer that?
What have they been voting for? Have they been voting for fewer doctors? Have they been voting for fewer care workers? Have they been voting for higher taxes?
You're not answering the question.
No, I mean, I'm not a politician. I'm making a case that I objectively want to make in terms of... And why hasn't that been delivered? I mean, the question is, practically speaking, why hasn't the government delivered it? Because it would come with an immense cost that is clearly made a decision. The government could change the immigration system. I agree with some of the criticisms that this is a democratic problem. The government could change the entire immigration system tomorrow and reduce immigration to tens of thousands. It would just basically mean bankrupting a whole bunch of institutions. It would mean mass shortages of doctors in the NHS. It would mean universities going bankrupt because they are to some extent dependent on foreign students. It would mean a lot of shortages across a lot of industries for labour. Like you obviously can do it. It's just that the trade-off is not worth it or hasn't been judged to be worth it.
So Matthew, you're saying that the government are fully aware of the fact that immigration would be disastrous for this country, and so they're purposefully not reducing it.
I think reducing it to tens of thousands would be, economically, they don't want to pull the policy levers that would lead to that level of reduction. And that's because they've decided it's too high cost. Well, I mean... Well, I mean,
you are at their conference, so I know.
Yeah.
Well, I'm happy with what's going on. I mean, look, as I said in my opening remarks, the Treasury Green Book is very clear. You cannot have very low, amounts of immigrations coming in, or else you won't be able to fund the other policy promises that they get voted in on. It's that simple. It is a cost. That they are essentially saying to the electorate, I'm sorry, you'll just have to let it go, and you'll keep voting for them. I mean, it's that simple. Well, that's fine then. It's your democratic right.
Karl, did you want to come in?
I was just going to say, the reason the government didn't get numbers down to the tens of thousands previously was because when we were in the EU, we couldn't, EU freedom of movement. The reason it hasn't happened since then is because we have partly accidentally built an incredibly liberal points-based system. We could change things around if we so choose, and the government are starting to do things to do that, for example, on dependents, on students. In terms of the economic argument, I mean, the OBR's long-term number at the moment, long-run net migration rate is 245,000, which is, okay, even if we take out Ukrainians and Hong Kongers, net migration last year was still 442,000. So there's clearly substantial scope to reduce numbers there. I would also add, partly this is all a figment of the OBR modelling process. So when full expensing ends at the end of the OBR medium-term forecasting period, the growth rate drops off. Therefore, to cover for this, they pump up the migration numbers because they think that every 60,000 migrants in their model equals 0.1% economic growth. And they do this because basically we want to reassure the bond market. So a lot of this is actually just financial alchemy. There are institutional factors, which means the government is incentivised to push for higher levels of migration. So as much as the Home Office and the Home Secretary might push back, you will always get the Treasury pushing one way, you'll get the Health Department pushing the other way, you'll get the education sector because they're committed to making universities an export industry pushing the other way. So to talk about the government as a monolithic thing doing X or Y or putting this or that lever simplifies it too much. There's lots of competing forces within government and stakeholders without government, and the net countervailing preponderance of those forces is acting in a way that is contrary to how people have voted at every major election in the last 25 years.
And I would just also think, I don't think it's necessarily a settled truth that, migration is always, net contributor to the Treasury. I mean, UCL study showed that between 1995 and 2011, I think it was over £100 billion migration has sort of taken out more than it had put in. And, it depends what sort of studies you do and what kind of assumptions you make. But, so absolutely, I would definitely challenge the idea that it's sort of settled wisdom that they're always net contributors.
Questions. Okay, I know some of these faces. Go on, Kieran at the back.
Hi. Thank you for the talk. Very good. I'm on the side of Karl and Conor, but I just think Matthew made a really interesting point. When you said about Hong Kongers, and you said, has anyone here had any issues with Hong Kongers? I think that's true. And I actually think this debate is way too wide, that the public doesn't have a problem with immigration like a magical number. It's where they come from. It's if you look at integration problems in this country, let's say Leicester, let's say the rape gangs in Rotherham, they weren't Hong Kongers, they weren't Australians, they were from third world countries. So is it really about should we reduce immigration from certain countries rather than this magical figure which we all get sort of wound up about? Do you actually think this debate should be a bit more narrow, essentially?
I think the residents of Clapham have probably had enough of Australians, but... Other than that, yes, it does seem like, and I think everyone can make this point in whatever direction you look at this debate. It is the different way you slice and dice it, including for the question about public finances, as we were kind of going back and forth there earlier. There is this obvious point that, some immigrants, I think on net immigrants are going to be positive public finances, but obviously not literally every immigrant is positive on public finances. Not necessarily so that's your only criteria. One other point to make, though, which is a more broader moral point, which is not just about whether or not immigration is good for the UK. It's also about whether or not immigration is good for the immigrants. If you're walking along one day, let's say you were just walking along and you see on the ground there, you see $80 trillion, and you're like, $80 trillion, would you walk past those $80 trillion or would you pick that up? And so $80 trillion is the benefit of, entire free open movement by some calculations. Because if you can move people from where they basically from places with failed institutions, the inability to start a business, to work, et cetera, to places that are more developed, it could boost the global economy by $80 trillion. So immigration is generally very, very good for immigrants. And that's kind of what that's about there. It makes immigrants extremely more productive. And there is a moral case there for immigration for the immigrants and not just for the UK, although I think immigrants are also good for the UK.
Do you want to come back on that? Yeah.
Quick interjection. Should we have open borders then? That would seem
no, but I think we should be intellectually fascinated by the idea. As in, we should be fascinated by the idea that immigrants are also worth putting into your calculation when you're considering the benefits of immigration.
I guess voters don't really, well, they might, but voters generally care about what will impact themselves rather than the welfare of the migrants that might be coming here. We've only got 5 minutes left. Let's take a couple at the same time. So questions. Let's take these 3 at the same time.
According to the Office of National Statistics, you have to earn about £41,000 before you're a net contributor to the Treasury. Wouldn't the really easy way to solve this be to say, okay, you can have immigration, but you have to earn over £41,000 a year?
Yes?
I think it's a great point about there's a moral calculus for immigrants as well, but I think it also goes the other way. If we're taking doctors from, say, Ghana needs doctors a lot more than we do, and the more people that we take with high skills from those countries, we may be improving things over here marginally, but we are preventing them ever building up the high-skill capital to produce developed economies themselves. And many of the people we're taking are precisely from those places which suffer the most from being undeveloped.
Thank you. I was just picking up on something that was said earlier about how immigration accelerated maybe in the late 90s and early 2000s and beyond. Did something change legally speaking, or what was the cause of that acceleration? Because I know people talk about Tony Blair liberalising things, but what was actually done and what changed?
Okay, so finances, brain drain on those countries where migrants are leaving, and why do we have these migration levels? Who wants to come in?
I'm happy to start on that. Yes, so the £40,000 figure, I mean, our paper says that basically if you can afford to come, you should be given the opportunity to. There's no real, overall pattern of which we're imposing here. I'm quite happy to have a visa auction system which, maintains high levels of immigration, but you have to buy the visa. I'm quite happy with that. I think I'm very comfortable with that, actually.
Privatise the visa system, then?
Yes. In terms of the point about, are we depriving other countries of doctors and nurses and electricians? My family home's in Crewe. Now, Crewe is a very high level of Polish immigration to the point where some of the signs are in Polish. And then I turned my eye to the EU growth statistics and how Poland per person will soon be overtaking the UK in GDP per capita. I don't think we've, brain drained them enough to stop us from being overtaken. I also, from the moral point of view there, why should we tell doctors who are skilled and have worked hard to make a better life for themselves where they can or can't work? If they don't want to work in Ghana, why should we force them? I think you can take quite a liberal point of view on that. And also there's the case of remittances too. Some of the largest movements of money in the world are through Western Union, they're through various different remittance apps. It's much more effective than foreign policy money, which just goes into the pockets of corrupt politicians and often malign government interests. Those remittances are very, very effective at creating economic growth. It is person to person. It is the most effective form of developing another country. Apart from, it is actually one of the most effective forms of developing another country. So I think it is good for other countries, immigration. If you're in Aleppo and your house has been bombed out, right, by evil Assad and his sarin gas, then I think it'd be okay to say, yes, come over and you can send some money back to the people you've had to leave behind. I think that's perfectly moral.
Let's take another round of questions and then we'll finish up. Let's take all 4.
Thank you very much. I've listened to this with quite an interest today. I take the position that the IEA say, but it seems to me that the whole argument is based on basically an economic argument. The Green Book's been mentioned, the Treasury Green Book, like it's the Bible. Hold it up, and this is the way forward. So the question would be, it'd be a hypothetical one, just to get your position on this as a principle. If the Green Book was to say, instead of us needing 300,000 a year, and bear in mind we're taking the population of Liverpool and Portsmouth combined every year, which I think is unsustainable. But if that same book said that we needed to take 2 million a year for our economic prosperity, would that figure be too great for you? And the reason why I ask is because I want to know whether you're completely basing your principle on economics, or whether there's any other factor that would make you say no at the level that we're talking about. So to clarify, if the Green Book said we needed 2 million immigrants a year, would you two still be advocating the policy, basing it on that fundamental, which is what your argument all the way through this conversation has been based on? Thank you.
Any other questions?
Cool. Thank you very much. A lot of the arguments around immigration today has been in trying to fill the gaps that we have within our economy in a variety of areas. But if we are to reduce the need for immigration, would it not make more sense to put a greater focus on actually stopping the 557,000 people emigrating from the UK? We're seeing a potential...
So stop them from leaving?
Create an incentive for people to want to stay in the UK. We're seeing a potential brain drain starting of young people going to Australia, America, or other parts of Europe.
Especially in the NHS.
Especially in the NHS, yes. So is it not...
Going off to Australia now,
Yeah, absolutely. So should we not be incentivising people to stay in the UK and thereby reduce the need for immigration in the first place? Thank you.
Yep, thank you very much. So there's a school of thought that back in the 18th century, one of the reasons why the Industrial Revolution started in Western Europe, say, opposed to Asia, was the fact because our lack of population meant we couldn't do the work to grow, so we automated through industry. Whereas in Asia, they had loads and loads of people, so they could just throw more manpower at a job. So when you mentioned before about the lack of workers in the low-level positions, I mean, is there not a side of that saying, well, eventually, because markets do adapt, so they're quite remarkable at doing that, will it spur further automation in that side of things, rather than trying to distort it by throwing more and more and more people at this low-level, low-skilled part of the industry?
Hello. Yes, just to follow up on that point, I don't know why Matt's so worried about the market. If we have less people, we will have more capital, and we will import certain things that we currently don't. What we will have is a high productivity economy. If we end up capping the number of people, then companies will have to produce the goods, and they will do that through high levels of automation and through outsourcing to other countries some of the low-skilled parts of jobs, which will also help developing countries get richer quicker. The idea that we get rich by just having more and more people, I mean, sub-Saharan Africa has the highest fertility rate in the world. It's also the poorest part. This obsession with more and more people is completely wrong, and productivity is the key to high wealth. And on that point, culture is fundamental. The reason we are richer than other countries is not because British people are these amazing, wonderful individuals. It's because of the culture and the institutions that have been transmitted over time. So mass immigration, by damaging the cultural transmission of the West, actually is a massive problem for both the West, but also the rest of the world, which relies on the technological improvements and other parts. And that's not to say we're against high-skilled immigration, but the idea that letting in lots of people to do low-skilled jobs is going to help anyone, I think is quite misguided.
Okay, we're already over time, so can whoever wants to jump in on any of those questions can, and then we'll finish up.
Why don't I jump in on the productivity question? I think the last two questions are quite major ones. I mean, you've got to remember that immigrants also bring capital with them in many ways. Immigrants bring ideas. Immigrants fulfill parts of the economy and skills that are needed. And I don't think the evidence is clear to make this claim that, immigration has been keeping down wages. In fact, quite the opposite. So I don't think it necessarily stacks up that way. I remember a couple of years ago at in fact, 2 years ago, this week at Party Conference, Boris sat up and said, we're finally moving towards a, high skill, high wage economy. What he was actually seeing was the first signs of inflation, which ended up, because of including because of skill shortages in the economy, meant that our living standards were about to decline and decline quite substantially over the next 2 years. So I think you can try to hope this idea that with cutting back immigration that'll lead to this high skilled capital investment nirvana. I think there's a lot of other reasons why we're not getting the investment we need, and it's not to do with immigrants. I think it's to do with overregulation and overtaxation.
I'll quickly jump in on the first couple of questions. Second one first. Basically turn us into prison island where you're not allowed to leave. That doesn't sound very good at all, to be honest. I'm very much against that.
Well, I think he's talking about the incentives rather than...
I understand that.
Make Britain better rather than keep them here.
I think all of us on this table are trying to make Britain better. To grow the economy, keep people here. I mean, I gave a comment to the Times a couple of months ago on why are people leaving the UK to go to Dubai, and then you compare the wages and you go, can you bloody blame them? I mean, really, it's
why aren't more going? Yeah.
Why aren't more going? Exactly. My plane ticket is booked. But no, I mean, seriously, it's a case of us having quite a bad economy. And as Matthew's already said, that's down to overregulation, overtaxation, the fact the Bank of England is completely unaccountable, etc., etc. I mean, it's not down to immigrants at all. So I would try and incentivize, but I certainly wouldn't lock them in. In terms of the Green Book, the reason I cite that so much is just to explain the political economy of decision making within central government. An interesting point, and a good test of if it said 2 million, would we say 2 million? I'd say yes, if things are really that bad. But it doesn't say 2 million. It says 300,000. So no, it's all right. Yeah. I mean, the reason I cited it, as I said, is to explain why government makes the decision it does. I mean, it makes the promises to cut immigration. The reason it doesn't cut immigration is because the economists in the Treasury, as I'm sure if you read any pieces I put out, I don't have the highest opinion of them in the world, but that they are the trusted sources, and that is why they make those decisions.
Yeah, and I think the argument that we must have high levels of net migration because we don't have enough doctors or we don't have enough people serving coffee and Pret is sort of a lazy approach to take for any kind of person who's interested in public policy. We have 1 in 5 Brits aren't in work. Let's get them into it. We could have more medical school places. We could train more doctors. We could put more incentives in place to stop all the doctors leaving and going to Australia. But we aren't doing that. We aren't answering those bigger questions. And the short-term stopgap is just to say, well, we must. And there's no other way. We must have high net migration. We should really be addressing these structural issues in our economy and our jobs market.
Karl, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I'd just say firstly, I completely agree with what Alex says, of course. The emigration question, I think that's a little bit of a red herring. The number of Brits emigrating has been fairly consistent in absolute numbers, not even relative numbers, for a couple of decades now. Maybe we've seen a few more doctors recently, or that's become a bit of a story because of sort of advertising campaigns by the Australian Health Service. But I don't think that's really a particular issue. On the productivity front, I would just add to what the gentleman over there said about sort of the origins of the Industrial Revolution. There's lots of studies looking at, for example, the American frontier and how when you have a labour shortage, capital substitutes. This is basic supply-demand stuff. And yes, there's lots of other reasons why capital investment in this country is so low, the planning system, the tax system, energy costs, etc. But if you're going to fix this, you need to attack it from all different angles, and immigration is undoubtedly one of those angles.
Thank you so much for joining me. We've got Matthew Lesh, Max Marlow, Conor...